Hello, I'm Esther Gidu. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance says a Trump administration will not impose a federal ban on abortion, while the Democratic presidential ticket of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz pushes for reproductive rights. Germany will donate 100,000 Mpox vaccine doses to help contain the outbreak in Africa, as WHO urges more countries to do so in the short term. And Israel and Hezbollah traded cross-border fire Sunday, marking the heaviest exchanges in months. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. We begin in the U.S., where the presidential race is kicking into full gear with Republican former President Donald Trump and his Democratic opponent, Vice President Kamala Harris, headed this week to some of the key states. Over the weekend, Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance said that he won't impose a federal abortion ban in the United States if he and Donald Trump win the White House. Meanwhile, the Democratic presidential ticket of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz keeps pushing its messaging for reproductive rights and announced a record-breaking number in campaign donations. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the details.
Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance was asked Sunday on NBC's Meet the Press whether he would commit to not imposing a national abortion ban if elected in November.
I can absolutely commit that.
His answer came 2 days after Trump wrote on his Truth social media platform, quote, "My administration will be great for women and their reproductive rights." But with some Republicans in Congress actively pushing for abortions to be banned nationwide, Vance was pressed further on NBC on whether Trump would veto that type of legislation if he were to return to the White House.
I think he would. He said that explicitly, that he would.
And America,
the Harris-Walz Democratic presidential campaign warns that reproductive rights would be obliterated under a Trump administration. Vice presidential nominee Tim Walz spoke about the matter during the recent Democratic National Convention.
And they will ban abortion across this country, with or without Congress.
The DNC overall was hailed as success by analysts. Democrats hope it will translate into a bump in the polls. Adding to the celebratory mood, the Harris-Walz campaign announced Sunday that it has raised $540 million since it launched. Senator Bernie Sanders, an independent, has expressed cautious optimism that Vice President Kamala Harris's road to the White House is clear.
I think it's going to be a rough campaign. I think the Vice President now has a very good chance to win it. She's certainly going to win the popular vote by millions of votes, and I think she has a great chance to win many of the battleground states.
Republican Senator Tom Cotton
unusual presidential election because Donald Trump has been president before. The American people know what he did. They know that he understands the kind of pain they've suffered for the last 4 years under Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and I think that's why they're ready to return Donald Trump to the White House.
Both campaigns have several events planned for this week. Vice President Harris and her running mate will kick off a bus tour in Georgia on Wednesday. Trump is expected to hold a town hall Thursday in Wisconsin and a rally Friday in Pennsylvania. Veronica Balderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
Several people were killed and 5 villages destroyed after torrential rains caused a dam to burst in eastern Sudan, as a war that has raged for 500 days leaves Sudan's infrastructure and civilians neglected. According to officials, the Arbart Dam, 70 kilometers north of the country's de facto capital, Port Sudan, crumbled after water and silt built up after days of unusual rains, which typically hit the area later in the year. The dam is the main source of water for Port Sudan, the base for the government and aid agencies, and home to hundreds of thousands of displaced people after most of the capital, Khartoum, was taken by the RSF at the start of the war. Sudan's health ministry said villagers from the area fled to the mountains, and some are stranded there Since Sunday, Sudan's dams, roads and bridges were in disrepair before the war between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces began in April 2023. The Sudan conflict remains unresolved, and a new report says more than 20,000 people have been killed since it broke out in April 2023. Viewers Philip Alexiou has more.
The conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces have brought on more than 7,000 events of political violence, with most of them recorded in Khartoum and the North Darfur states from July 6 to August 16th, according to armed conflict location and event data. U.S.-led mediators say they've secured guarantees from Sudan's warring parties at talks in Geneva to improve access for humanitarian aid, but the failure of the army to show up in person has hindered progress. Promises have been secured to let aid flow through the Adre crossing into Sudan's western Darfur region and along the Daba Road from Port Sudan, and progress toward opening another route through the Sennar Junction. U.S. Sudan envoy Tom Perriello.
We hope that this will be a source of momentum for much bigger steps in progress down the road, but that will only happen if we continue to have that unity of purpose for saving lives, and that we continue to keep a focus on the people of Sudan. The sad thing is the crisis in Sudan is so severe that we could do 4 of these and still be barely scratching the surface of what the Sudanese people deserve. But let's start that journey together, and let's keep making the steps forward that we can.
Perriello says despite the difficult efforts to end the fighting, efforts will go forward.
We do believe that a national cessation of hostilities is possible. We know that that is going to take a great deal of work. And I think all of us are going to continue as a team and in our individual capacities to push for those efforts at peace.
The conflict in Sudan began last year when competition between the army and the RSF, who had previously shared power after staging a coup, flared into open warfare. Philip Alexiou, VOA News.
For 16 months, the war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces has caused untold suffering to Sudanese civilians and forced 10 million people to flee their homes, while another 25 million face acute hunger, while 1 million people are staring at starvation. For more on the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, I'm joined live via Skype from the U.S. state of Pennsylvania by Akshaya Kumar, Crisis Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. Akshaya, welcome to Africa 54. Human Rights Watch has done extensive research on Sudan's war. Let's start off with your findings on the impact of the war on children.
Well, this war has been devastating, particularly for young children. In almost every piece of research we do, we see children are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of this conflict. And that is evident in the use of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls. We have documented cases of young girls being raped, including raped repeatedly, both in Darfur, particularly in the city of El Geneina, where sexual violence was targeted against members of the Masalit community, but also in Khartoum, Durman, and Bahri, where Human Rights Watch did work talking to providers of care who found cases of young girls being raped by RSF fighters. But it's not just, of course, sexual violence. Children's education has been interrupted. Their access to immunizations and regular vaccinations. The psychosocial impact of this conflict is undeniable. We've also heard reports of the use and recruitment of child soldiers. And I think perhaps most worrying of all are the famine conditions, which have been confirmed in Zamzam camp for internally displaced people in Darfur, where we know children are starving to death. We know that the indicators for malnutrition are sky high, and little kids, you can see it with their arms being measured with that very classic look of famine tape, are the ones who are bearing the brunt.
Now, Akshaya, as a result of this war between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces, as you mentioned, millions of people are facing acute hunger and others are staring at starvation. What can be done to increase the aid available at this point to the hungry people in Sudan?
The biggest thing that needs to happen right now is more access for humanitarian aid workers to consistently move both across lines, that means across territories that are controlled by different fighting factions, and also across borders, which means into Sudan, from Chad, from neighboring South Sudan, from Egypt, wherever needed for humanitarian aid delivery. There was a big breakthrough with the authorities confirming that the Adre crossing between Chad and Darfur, which had been closed for many weeks, if not months, will now be held open for 3 months. But we still need to watch to see if trucks are able to cross consistently and given the permission to deliver the food to the people who are hungry. But it's not just about crossings. We are also deeply concerned about the looting of humanitarian warehouses, about the attacks on aid workers that make it harder and harder for people who are trying to save lives to do that because they themselves are being put in jeopardy. This is a phenomenon we have documented. Both sides, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, have been involved in.
Akshaya, today marks a very significant day in Sudan. 500 days since this war began. What trends stand out for you?
Well, for me, the three things that stand out are first, that we are facing this conflict, this war, and these atrocities because of cycles of impunity in Sudan. The two men leading the fighting forces, General Burhan and Mohammed Hamdan Hemeti, they both had a hand in being the architect of atrocities back in the early 2000s. And one can only think if there had been justice then for those crimes, we might not be in the situation that we're in now. But the other issue is global inaction in the face of a protection vacuum. I think more and more you hear that no place is safe in Sudan for a civilian, and that's because no one is standing up for civilian protection. And so we at Human Rights Watch are very keenly watching the discussions happening both at the African Union level in Addis Ababa and also in New York as the UN and the AU evaluate how they might step in to create spaces for protection, to allow for the delivery of humanitarian aid, and to create some sense of safety for Sudanese.
Quickly, Akshaya, it's just a few days since Senator Ben Cardin sent a letter to the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres asking for efforts to be redoubled in Sudan in the wake of this declaration of famine. What would a change or the presence of the United Nations have if they were present inside Sudan?
Well, we know, of course, that the UN had a mission in Sudan until the end of the year last year, when the Sudanese authorities told them to leave. And what we're hearing increasingly from our Sudanese partners, from human rights defenders, from women's rights defenders, is they want to see international presence back in the ground in Sudan. They remember the benefit it provided for women in Darfur, even the accompaniment on patrols so that they could safely gather firewood, so they could cook for their families or get the water they need for bathing, eating, and drinking. They know that green zones or police could play a role in enabling the delivery of humanitarian aid, and that locally mediated ceasefires could be even now, as the negotiations continue at the national level, these locally mediated ceasefires could be monitored by external forces to try to provide that semblance of stability. And so I think that letter from Senator Cardin, it's very important. It shows U.S. lawmakers are engaged, they're watching the situation in Sudan. But what we need to see next is action. Action from the Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council to respond to the dire situation that we're seeing in Sudan today.
Akshaya, thank you so much for your insight into what's happening in Sudan and for letting us know. Akshaya Kumar is Crisis Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. Germany will donate 100,000 Mpox vaccines doses from its military stocks to help contain the outbreak on the African continent in the short term, as well as provide help to the affected countries. A government spokesperson said on Monday the government will provide the World Health Organization with flexible financial resources via various instruments to combat Mpox and also support its partners in Africa through the Gavi Vaccination Alliance. Germany has around 117,000 doses of Jynneos, which is being stockpiled by the German army after Berlin procured it in 2022. The government was looking at the quickest way to get the vaccines to the affected countries, primarily the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Burundi and neighboring countries in East Africa, according to a foreign ministry spokesperson. Israel and Hezbollah traded cross-border fire Sunday, marking the heaviest exchanges in months. Israel's military also hit Hamas targets in Gaza, all ahead of ceasefire talks in Egypt. VOA's Arashar Basadi reports.
Israel says it launched airstrikes targeting thousands of rocket launchers to foil what it called an imminent attack from the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah. Hezbollah, meanwhile, says it fired hundreds of rockets and drones at Israel as payback for the killing of a top commander in Beirut last month. The uptick in violence marks the heaviest exchanges in months, and Israel says there's more to come.
We are hitting Hezbollah. 3 weeks ago, we eliminated the chief of staff, and today we foiled the offensive plan. Nasrallah in Beirut and Khamenei in Tehran should know this is another step on the way to changing the situation in the north. And I repeat, this is not the end of the story.
Netanyahu respectively naming the leaders of Hezbollah and Iran in his statement. Meanwhile, on Saturday, local aid workers in Gaza said Israeli airstrikes killed at least 36 Palestinians there. The Israeli military said it was looking into the reports. All this just hours ahead of ceasefire talks in Egypt's capital, Cairo.
We have a very volatile situation in the Middle East. We have had that for a long time now. The good news is it appears that both Hezbollah and Israel are trying to de-escalate. I hope that happens, and I hope we reach a ceasefire with Hamas, Israel and Hamas, as soon as possible.
And while the violent uptick grounded some flights out of Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport, for now at least it seems not to have triggered a larger-scale conflict in the region. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
Would like to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, a Ghanaian-American artist creates art that reflects the beauty of Ghana's culture and African history. We'll be right back.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, we take you to the U.S. state of Maine, where a global program brings together youth from regions that are deeply divided by conflict to help them learn to understand one another and how communities can coexist in peace despite diversity. Join me, Vincent McCory, on the next edition of Straight Talk Africa as we take you inside the seats of Peace Summer Camp and learn more about the program and how it's changing perceptions and attitudes across conflict lines.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linoch Mudu, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
In other news, Tunisian President Kais Saied has shuffled the cabinet, replacing 19 ministers responsible for defense, foreign affairs, and the economy. The move comes ahead of the presidential election scheduled for October 6. The two leading contenders in Ghana's presidential election have launched dueling manifestos promising fiscal stability, jobs, and a path out of the country's worst economic downturn in a generation. The election set for December 7 is of utmost importance as it will determine the successor to President Nana Akufo-Addo and the country's future direction. And the Chinese hospital ship Peace Ark is docked in Cape Town for a joint exercise between China and South Africa, which aims to provide humanitarian medical aid and strengthen military and diplomatic ties. China is expanding its imports of semi-processed agriculture from Africa in an effort to address a trade imbalance and also as a way of diversifying global food chains amid geopolitical tensions. Kate Bartlett visits South Africa's rural Limpopo province, where avocado farmers are getting ready to export their products to the Chinese market for the first time.
This fruit is so valuable, it's been dubbed green gold, and it's destined for China.
At the end of the BRICS summit last year, the deal was signed to export avocados to China. So we now have access to China, but there's been a big process in between to meet all the requirements of the protocol that was agreed to. And we're very close now to being able to send the first shipment to China.
Derek Donkin is the CEO of a South African Fruit Growers Association and has been working with Chinese inspectors to open so-called green lanes to get avocado exports off the ground. China has long been the African continent's biggest trade partner, but the Asian giant exports some $60 billion more in goods to Africa each year than it imports. In South Africa's case, China exported $11 billion more than it imported in 2022, the most recent year for which figures are available.
Because there's been a strong impetus from the Chinese as well to make sure that this deal happens, because they're aware of that trade imbalance and that they need to be taking more exports from South Africa.
South Africa also exports its agricultural produce to the EU and US, which are its third and fourth largest markets respectively, behind the African continent and China. Many of South Africa's agricultural products benefit from tariff-free access to the US market under Washington's African Growth and Opportunity Act. The avocado deal with Beijing was made last year when South Africa hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping on a state visit alongside the summit of the BRICS group of emerging economies. At the time, South Africa urged China to address the trade deficit. Experts say China is also expanding its imports of semi-processed agriculture from Africa to ensure food security and avoid price inflation.
Another kind of bigger geostrategic reason for the push on food exports is similar to kind of diversify the global agricultural supply chain. You know, you've had this pressure on China, you've got the soybean pressure from the US, you've got different pressures and trade tensions between Australia and China.
As part of its agricultural push in Africa, China also imports soybeans, citrus, wine and rooibos tea from South Africa, avocados and tea from Kenya, and coffee from Rwanda and Ethiopia. China's new ambassador to South Africa, Wu Peng, has promised measures are being taken to speed up the export of more agricultural products to China. The potential of this is huge, says Clive Garrett, marketing manager for ZZ2, a South African farming conglomerate which will soon be exporting its avocados to China.
Until October in 2023, South Africa really could only export to Europe, a little bit to the Middle East. But now, since then, we've had Japan, China and India open to us. And these are very exciting markets because the per capita consumption in these markets is still incredibly low. So we see huge opportunities of going into these markets.
According to industry estimates, there are some 300 million people in China earning enough to buy imported fruit. That can only be good news for farmers and workers here in this bucolic mountain town. Kate Bartlett, VOA News, Zanin, Limpopo, South Africa.
Rita Mawena Benesan, a Ghanaian-American artist, creates art that reflects the beauty of Ghana's culture and African history. She's extending her passion to a campaign that seeks the return of artifacts that were created in Ghana centuries ago, but now sit in Western museums. Senanu Todd has this report from Accra, Ghana.
In her creative studio in Accra, Rita Mawena Benesan is remaking royal umbrellas. In public settings, Ghanaian chiefs sit under these umbrellas, and the golden totems and relics show their level of authority. The details are in their designs, and that's what Benesan is showing through her exhibitions.
The royal umbrella kind of comes to play on how it's an object that is seen as a protector object, but it's also an object that showcases power and hierarchy.
Raised and trained in the United States, Benesan is committed to showcasing African heritage Through arts, she collects archives of films, photographs, documents, and artifacts of African culture for her foundation Sihene, which translates the making of a chief in Twi, a language spoken in southern and central Ghana. Benison says her challenge is accessing these materials on the continent itself.
How does a student who's Ghanaian American, coming back home, have less access of these photos, visuals, artifacts in Ghana, but in the States or in Europe has more access to it?
Ghanaian historian Osebonsu Safo-Kantanka says about 90% of African cultural heritage artifacts are located outside the continent. He says they were looted during the colonial era.
They are not just arts. They are of spiritual significance, economic significance, social and moral significance.
Advocates have been calling on the return of these artifacts back to their original countries and rightful owners. This year, Ghana's Ashanti Kingdom saw the return of artifacts from the United States and the United Kingdom. The Fowler Museum at the University of California in Los Angeles returned 7 royal artifacts to the Menchia Palace Museum in Kumasi permanently, while the British Museum and Victoria and Albert Museum sent back 32 items, including gold peace pipes and a 300-year-old sword. But the items were returned on loan. Locals say they want a permanent return.
It sounds incomprehensible because it was taken from here. You have no idea how they were made. You came in as armed robbers and took it away. So if you have realized that it's mine and you're bringing it back, it is a matter of just giving it back. But you say it's low.
Historical practices of claiming spoils of war complicate the permanent return of artifacts. Safo-Kantanka says a legislative order from the UK is needed for museums to return artifacts permanently. In the meantime, Benison hopes that her umbrella exhibitions could create more awareness and spark conversation about the importance of restitution.
When people walk into a museum, when people walk into a gallery space, they're seeing these umbrellas, they're seeing these totems, they're seeing the stools, the thrones. Literally, many of the elements of the regalias that are used within the chieftaincy is in their forefront. So we're not hidden. We're literally right in people's faces, and which is also like a call to action to say, no, you cannot hide us.
Benison has held exhibitions in other parts of Africa and Europe and plans to organize more, hoping to boost her own career as well as the push to bring African artifacts back home. Sana Anutot, VOA News, Accra, Ghana.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thank you for watching.